the most, rapidly put together book because, of course, this is out now, and the war, although far too long ago, did start this very year. That's an extraordinary thing.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the war is ongoing, so we actually can't tell the full story of the war. But it's a first draft of the history of how it happened or how we got here. And my motivation was there's going to be a million excellent books written by my colleagues in Ukraine about the tragedy of Ukraine, but it wasn't really the mystery for me. The mystery of the war is how Putin got to this place, how we, what his motivations were in starting the war, and it's also a history of the first 6 months of the war right up to the beginning of October. So yeah, it was very tight on the deadlines. But I was also the important thing was that actually I spent most of the war in I was in Moscow 3 times. So it's actually the war from the Russian side, which is actually, I think we haven't heard nearly enough about. And it's really important to understand what's going on inside Russia, because we're sort of deluged by Ukraine reporting and the view from Kiev. And I think there are some flaws in that view, and they're not very helpful either for our understanding or for Kiev's expectations.
What sort of flaws?
Well, I think one of the biggest problems with the reporting of this war, is I think people assume that the Russian people are cognizant of the fact that they're losing it. But actually, the view from Moscow is really different. And actually, Kherson is a really brilliant example because, we see, the jubilation on the streets of Kherson. It's actually very moving, amazing images and people coming out and sort of weeping and crying and hugging Ukrainian soldiers. I promise you, today, the Russians see this completely differently. They say that they've denied the Ukrainians a victory, which is actually partly true, by the way. By retreating, the Russians had a choice of being bottled up on the wrong side of the river and facing defeat and capture of their whole army, or retreating in good order and actually sort of readjusting their front lines and abandoning a city that they couldn't have held. So for them, it's like a sort of Dunkirk moment. It's a sort of heroic withdrawal and very sensible. And really importantly, that's the Kremlin media, but actually even a lot of the media that has been very critical of the Kremlin, in other words, the right-wing nationalist bloggers, and they do exist, and there's a lot of them who think that Putin is like a namby-pamby and is too soft on the Ukrainians. There's a whole sort of spectrum of much scarier than Putin military bloggers and politicians. And even those guys who actually have been quite vocal in their criticism of Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, and the prosecution of the war, those guys have been saying, like, well done, you've saved our soldiers. We're now reinforcing the east bank of the Dnieper, and they'll never cross it. So in that sense, actually, it's really important to understand what the Russians are being think about the war.
You say the Russians, but those are examples, of course, of the Russian media or bloggers and the way that they convey it. Do you have a way of interpreting what the Russian people think? Do they think that? Does it feed down to them, or are they starting to question that narrative and that rhetoric?
That's a really good. That's the giant question. And we do actually have opinion polling. It's one of the odd things about modern Russia is the extent to which the Kremlin, by the way, is obsessed with opinion polls. They have they actually bought up every single one except for one independent polling agency. They're obsessed with public opinion. And in fact, in that sense, it's really important to remember that Putin is actually rather like Erdogan and Orban. He's actually a really successful populist. He doesn't rule through terror. He terrorizes the very small percentage of the population that actually vocally opposes him. But he's actually very sensitive to it. So what do the latest polls say? They say that public opinion is shifting slightly against the war. But again, there's no sense of a sort of tidal wave or turning point or tipping point. And in fact, the real lesson of the polls has been, just before the beginning of the war and in October, it was 15% of the Russian population passionately for, 15% strongly against, 35% mildly for, 35% mildly against. It was very split. And those numbers weirdly didn't change despite the disasters in Kharkiv Oblast and everything. And the latest poll, the Levada Center, is more or less the only sort of last independent polling organization. And they show the, a slight shift, but it's now 44% who are mildly for rather than, mildly against rather than 35%. But it's not a landslide by any means. And the really important thing is that's not at all evident is that the Russian authorities have really kind of downplayed this war. And definitely until September 21st, I was in Moscow at the time, until Putin's mobilization on September 21st, the war was invisible in Moscow. Like nobody talked about it. It was completely, you had no idea in Moscow, you're in the capital of a country that is waging the biggest war of the 21st century. It was invisible, and deliberately so. And after 21st of September, things changed actually, because everyone saw that suddenly their husbands and fathers and brothers could actually be mobilized, but not dramatically so. So although there is a significant military victory on the ground in Kherson, so far there's no real signs of any kind of sort of ripples or distress or sort of stress lines appearing in Russian society as yet.
Is that right? Because at the beginning we did see quite a lot of footage of protests. There were many stories of Russian protesters of all ages being sent to prison. Have those gone? Are they still on the streets of Moscow?
Well, I was there as well. Sorry, but it was in Moscow. I was on Pushkin Square, like on the first day of the war, before the quote-unquote protest. There were, 400 people walking down Rochesensky Boulevard. We know from an NGO called Over There Info that 18,000 people have been arrested over the course of the year. So far, there have been like 200 people who are facing serious charges of treason and fake and distributing fakes. The new law that puts people in prison for up to 15 years, but so far no one's been put in prison for 15 years. Actually the numbers, the sad comparison is to Iran. Literally Iranian schoolgirls have put the Russian opposition to shame. Like there is the scale of the Russian protests is basically as yet nowhere.
There's so much to ask about, why that might be. But I suppose we started off by saying what has happened in the reports about Kherson. And now we've questioned the reports with you and the way that we're talking about it, in that it is a humiliation for Putin.
Definitely.
Will he see it that way?
No. I think that the key problem of this war is the fact that Putin lives in an information bubble. And that was the reason why he started the war, because all autocrats start wars for one reason, is because they think they can win them. They overestimate their own powers, they underestimate the enemy. And in order to do that, you have to be in the focus, you have to be in a bubble of misinformation. And that's, in fact, what Putin was. And there's no indication that he really has any access to any kind of dissident voices. The significant thing about Kherson is actually that he's clearly listening to pragmatic moves. Pragmatic voices among his generals. So, for instance, he's not, I'm a historian, so I'm a bit wary of historical analogies, but, it's not like Hitler insisting that General Paulius, hold Stalingrad at all costs, which is militarily disastrous. Paulius should have abandoned Stalingrad. He couldn't hold it. Putin is actually much more pragmatic than that. His generals are telling him, there's no point in holding Kherson. This is never, and therefore we must withdraw. So actually, slightly, in fact, strategically, it's a disaster, but actually it shows a kind of pragmatism, which is, of course, rather bad news for Ukraine. The Ukrainians want Putin to make terrible mistakes. Kherson was an inevitable retreat because they were defeated, definitely. The Ukrainians won, but the Russians managed to retreat in good order, which suggests that they're actually slightly less pig-headed and inefficient and amateurish than they had been earlier in this campaign.
So it's possible to say both things, that Putin is in this sort of information bubble, which you write about, kind of coming out of kind of COVID and isolation, and this bunker mentality in which he hid away from everyone, and wrote his essay and sort of gathered his thoughts. But also at the same time, he does listen to other voices. He doesn't just go with his own whims. He listens to his advisors or generals.
Well, in this particular case, it seems that the generals made a decision. Surovikin, the new guy on the ground, the new appointee, seems to have taken that pragmatic decision. I mean, I think he had no choice, or rather, he had the choice to stand his ground and fight to the last soldier. But I think that was the pragmatism reigned. I mean, the problem is we don't really understand, or no one really understands, that relationship between Putin and his generals. Who's making the calls, we don't know. But in this particular case, we see that the general on the ground bowed to reality and actually effected quite a successful withdrawal and minimized their losses and strengthened their defenses.
And perhaps you could explain to listeners about that mentality of Putin's. It's fascinating about just how kind of COVID affected him, and the isolation levels and the sort of levels he went to.
Yeah, he was profoundly paranoid, and of course and he went into deep isolation. They actually, as a matter of public record, they spent 85 million euros building quarantine centres in his various palaces and villas and so on, and he stayed in isolation far longer than the rest of Russia did. He was still in it for 2 years later. Hence the sort of comedy sort of 6 meter long tables at which he sat down with Macron. And we happen to know that the reason why he's sitting 6 meters down the table is that Macron refused to do a COVID test administered by Russian doctors because they were afraid that the Russian doctors would get Macron's DNA and make some sort of bioweapon out of it. But he's deeply paranoid about COVID. Obviously, that's fueled speculation about his ill health. I personally didn't come across any sources that confirmed that he's chronically ill. Bill Burns, the director of the CIA, said earlier this summer that he's all too well. So, but we don't know. But the strategic and political implications of the fact that he's sitting in that COVID bubble actually mean that he's always been isolated. And the whole story of his career is that more and more of the people, the pragmatists, they call them the technocrats, the liberals, but they're not really very liberal. But nonetheless, people who actually sort of, as what one might describe as members of the reality-based community, are like leaving his circle, and he's left in the room with people who he's worked with and known since the mid 1970s. Literally, I mean, these people have been mates for half a century and colleagues, and those very paranoid old KGB men were the last people in the room, literally physically in the room, because everyone else was excluded.
I have to ask before I let you go, you say we don't know how it will end, but we know how it will not end. It's really, I can't ask you to predict the future, but what are your thoughts about where this is going to go and how long for?
Well, how long for is very difficult to tell, but the sad truth is that at a certain point, military campaigns are rather like gas. You can actually sort of compress it and compress it and compress it, but the more you compress it, the more the resistance is. So even, and as Adam Smith said, there's a lot of ruin in a nation. Russia can take a lot of punishment and lose a lot of ground while still being able to claim victory. So the one takeaway is, I fear that actually whatever the outcome finally is, Ukraine will have to face the reality of some sort of territorial loss. And furthermore, they will consider themselves to have been betrayed, whatever the final settlement is. Ukraine will cry, or part of Ukrainian society will call betrayal. And it's very significant that already the Americans are putting pressure on the Ukrainians to use this retreat from Kherson as an opportunity to open up talks. And the Ukrainians are adamantly against that because they know what I've just said is that actually talks can only end in land for peace. There is zero actual operational chance of the Ukrainians getting the Russians out of every single centimetre of the country that they've taken since 2014. I mean, especially and above all Crimea. That's just not going to happen. And also, there's no reason why that should happen, because, I mean, we are really are going to use Western blood, Western treasure and Ukrainian blood to compel Crimeans who really don't want to be part of Ukraine to be part of Ukraine. I mean, we know we're not in that business. Donbass is much more difficult, it's much more complex, but nonetheless, you have the fact of de facto ethnic cleansing. All the pro-Kiev people have gone. They haven't been there for 8 years. So you're left with parts of Ukraine that really don't want to be Ukrainian. It's like it's a very hard truth. But I mean, there's more of a chance that they'll go back to the pre-war frontiers, but even that will be catastrophic for Putin. So Putin will do everything in his power to prevent that. So I'm afraid the end game is going to be some sort of land for peace deal, you know, and the Ukrainians are going to be fighting that politically as well as doggedly as they've been fighting, you know, physically on the ground.